an ethnic media lens. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. This week, our focus is on the race gap in the 2020 presidential elections. While majorities of Latino, Black, and Asian voters voted for Biden, the majority of white voters, 3 out of 5, supported Trump, according to exit polls. There was even a small increase over 2016 in white women voters for Trump. We've asked 3 experts to explore this voter turnout, this gap, and we're honored today to have 3 great speakers. Arlie Russell Hochschild, sociology professor at UC Berkeley, author of 10 books, most recently, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. Also on our panel is Mindy Romero, founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the University of Southern California's Sol Price School of Public Policy, and Davin Phoenix, assistant professor of political science at the School of Social Sciences at the University of California, Irvine. Please enter your questions in the chat box, and we will reserve 3 to 4 minutes following each speaker for Q&A. On behalf of EMS, our thanks to Blue Shield of California Foundation, the State Infrastructure Fund, and the Ford Foundation for supporting our briefings on electoral issues. Thanks to our veteran reporters, Pilar Marrero and Sunita Sarabji, for coordinating these weekly Zoom briefings, and to our interpreters, Oscar Arteta and Jackie No, who provide simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and Korean. Above all, thank you to all our ethnic media colleagues for joining these briefings. We will be sending out a video of today's call along with collateral material and extended bios on each of our speakers. Now I turn the conference over to our moderator, Pilar Marrero.
Thanks, Sandy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And as Sandy was discussing before we started, we heard a lot about why Latinos, why African Americans, why minorities voted the way they did, as we always do from the mainstream media. And we thought it would be only fair and necessary for us to turn around and look at why the white voters voted for Trump in a majority, as a majority. So we really need to understand each other if we are to continue being a coherent country. So we invited a stellar panel, and the first person in that stellar panel is Arlie Russell Hochschild, which Sandy has introduced, and she has done very interesting research on the white, let's call it Trump base, or the white conservative voter. And she wrote a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And she has really important insights. Arlie, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, it's my great pleasure. Yeah.
Right, go ahead.
Go ahead.
On.
Right. Well, it's so great to be here. Sandy's a dear old friend and Pilar a new one, and glad to join Mindy and Darwin here. So in my 10 minutes, I thought that we should just start backing up to look at what this, at the size of this divide between, let's say, Republicans and Democrats, and how could it be that 74 million Americans have voted for Donald Trump after 4 years when they've seen who he is? I mean, I think we're all asking that one. There was a really interesting, just to back up on the divide itself, a really interesting survey that came out a year ago, looking at how Democrats as a group understand Republicans and how Republicans understand Democrats. And in one of the items, it asked Democrats, how many Republicans do you think racism is still a problem today? And the Democrats estimated, half, 50%. Actually, it was 80%. And then Republicans were asked, well, how many Democrats do you think that most policemen are bad people? And Republicans estimated half. Actually, it's 15%. So not only do we disagree, but we don't even agree on what we disagree about. It's that bad. And since I began doing research on the Deep South Tea Party enthusiasts, now Trump enthusiasts in middle of Louisiana, since that time, I think the sides have hardened because there is a Trump effect. I mean, he's been trying to divide, and he has been successful in this. So that's where to start with. One other point, this survey, and I wrote an op-ed for The Guardian on this last year, you could look it up, found that Democrats were worse at predicting what Republicans thought than Republicans were in predicting what Democrats thought. In other words, and education didn't help. And so I scratched my head on that one. How could it be? I mean, we're the more curious ones. We're reaching out. Don't we know more? No, we don't. Because we're more likely to live in urban, big cities that are enclaves. We don't mean to be enclave. We don't mean to we don't believe in bubbles, even political bubbles, but we're more in those bubbles because we're urban on the whole. So that's to start with. And the point I think we can draw from that is that the shoe is on our foot. It's in our interest to get out there and get what the mindset of that 74 million people, nearly half the country. So I guess the next thing I'd like to say is that we have an image of the Trump supporter that I would describe as sitting pretty. You know, a lot of people on the left will say, oh, those people that voted for Trump, they have a red MAGA hat, they're pumping, their signs, they're sitting pretty, right? They have it, they want to hold on to it. That's I think the first image, certainly the one I started with. There are some like that, but on the whole, all the interviews I've done, and a lot in 5 years in the heartland of Trump in southern Louisiana around the petrochemical industry, and now I'm doing work in Appalachia, in eastern Kentucky, and the sitting pretty image describes very few other people I'm getting to know. The next kind of image that I think comes to mind popularly is the wealthy guardian. You remember in the Trump campaign, this St. Louis couple, the McCloskeys, that were brandishing guns against Black Lives Matter protesters, marchers. I see a little of that, and that's a kind of major image, but I don't think that's who I'm seeing. So there's this third image that I'm actually in the process of trying to get clear on myself. So we're all thinkers and explorers here, but I'll tell you what my journey is leading me to think. It's that a lot of white people, and by white people that I'm focusing on, are blue collar, high school educated, they don't have college. And they're Christian, and not all Pentecostal. And right now I'm doing interviews for people in the hollers of Eastern Kentucky. And they feel like a minority group. I know this sounds hard to believe, but they feel like a kind of minority group themselves. And they actually feel that life is rigged against them. They get their picture of reality from not only Fox News, but they'll tune in to CNN, MSNBC, sometimes just to taste what the other side thinks, but also, you know, to kind of be interested. And what they see there, they say, oh, look at all the people of color that are newscasters and, you know, weather people, and no white men anymore, gosh. And then they see Black football stars and basketball stars getting multi-million-dollar deals to advertise stuff. And they think, wow, they're millionaires, they're billionaires. Gosh, those Blacks are really getting ahead. So they haven't taken some course in ethnic studies in college, right? They're looking at the media, and this is kind of the impression they get. And they also, when they went to high school, they would see that there was a special room for the Chicano studies people and African Americans. And they think, what about us whites? We don't have a special club. And if we did, we'd be seen as racist. So there's a sense of being left out. Now, not everybody is really abjectly poor, but I have talked to people who are pretty close. And here was what one guy said to me. He was born in a trailer park, and he said, well, my mom and dad wouldn't let me get out because there were just drugs everywhere. My uncle was stealing in the backyard, and there's a murder 3 trailers down. He said, and he had been in special ed in high school. He said, I'm poor and I'm dumb, he said. And he was very angry at the left. He was, but more left than right. He was in the middle. And so his wife is more progressive than he. Anyway, he said, you know, if you compare my life to the life of someone in Detroit or Chicago or, you know, the Bronx, he said, you know, there's drugs there, there's drugs here. People aren't working there and people aren't working here. People are going to jail there, people are going to jail here. You know, guys aren't living with the mothers of their children and aren't doing much with those kids. That's true there, that's true here. He said, I don't see much difference between them and us except for the music. And that is a refrain. Like, we're like Blacks, it's not that different. And yet in the mass media, it's part of the culture that they feel in a way colonized by, a liberal culture that says whites are bad, they're racist, and men are bad, they're rapists. And kind of a put down of white men, I think I know it you have to wrap your mind about it, but I'm just trying to describe what I'm hearing. So they feel kind of like a minority group that is in decline. And they feel that people of color are rising and they are declining. Now, You and I know that if we look at Blacks in the last 30 years, that household income has not risen in the last 30 years, and that 2008, they had their money in their houses and they lost that. And you and I know that education, affirmative action didn't bump them ahead of poor whites, but that doesn't, that's not on their radar. If we focus on their radar, which comes from the mass media, they're sinking and others are rising. And I've asked people, I don't know my 10 minutes, but I just want to say that I think there are lots of kinds of stories that could be written to reach across this divide. I think a macro story that tells what NAFTA has done to Mexico, for example, putting a lot of farmers out of work and making them want to be, come to America, or climate stories that show there are climate migrants, and stories that connect the migrant history of Mexicans and Latinos with the migrant histories of Europeans. Actually, in Appalachia, people are immigrants. They've lost jobs, coal jobs are down, no good jobs have come in, and they're leaving for Cincinnati, where also the big industries are down. They're immigrants, and they have little villages in Cincinnati, little, kind of streets where everyone from a certain holler, can meet their neighbor's brother. So there are some connections that could be made that I don't see out there in the mainstream press. And I guess finally, we could remind them that there's a lot of work that Latinos do that is not competitive with what whites do. I think that is out there in the mainstream somewhat, but, and finally, I think there could be some interesting work on the whole idea of displacement, that if you're if you're down, you're wanting to blame someone. And let me just say this emotional point, the people that I'm getting to know are not angry, entitled, assertive. They're a little depressed. They're a little bit frightened, actually. And if somehow an article and writing could reach across to that depression and fear and say, look, we've felt it too. Rather than, oh, you racist, that's just going to backfire, honestly. It already has. Race is there, but I think the best approach would be to say, look, we get it. One final point. I asked them, well, how about Trump? Has Trump helped you here in Eastern Kentucky, actually? Are there more coal jobs? No. He promised them, but they're not there. Are there new industries come in? Well, not really. Is your water any cleaner? No. Is the opiate crisis more in control? No. So actually nothing. Life isn't better for them 4 years later, but they're still voting for him. And I think part of that is that they're going for the wish. And the other part of it is they don't see the Democratic Party. It just doesn't have a face there. It's nobody seems to be reaching out for them. You know, there's an invisibility. You know, here's what the Democrats are trying to do. Here's the bipartisan effort. There's nothing on that. So let me end there, but those were just thoughts to share with you on who these people are and how you might, how it might affect your writing.
Thank you, Arlie. And thank you so much, especially for that last part, suggesting some stories that we might do in the future, because I think that's very helpful. I wanted to ask you, and I know you've done research before this book on white college-educated women, because everyone expected women, certain white women, to move back in their support of Trump. And there were articles written, you know, he's losing these women, and he didn't. He didn't lose these women. There's actually, according to some exit polls, a little bit more support, or at least stable. So how can we understand that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for it.
And you have a minute.
They aren't as firm in their support of Trump as their husbands and brothers and uncles are. It's not as strong. So it'll show up as a vote, but it's like half a vote. And the other is right to life is a big issue. And that they feel they've attached their fate to that of the men in their kin system. So they're not thinking, oh, me, could I rise? They're thinking us, and we're sinking.
Henrietta Burroughs has a couple questions. Why don't you ask?
Thanks, Pilar. What can we do to get beyond the Trump effect, given how pervasive it has been and how powerful it has been? And also, you talked about the people not being angry but depressed, but when you see groups like the Patriot Boys, they seem very angry and willing to act out their anger.
Right, right. That is who we see. The Proud Boys. I've actually interviewed some white nationalists, and that's a scary story. A lot of them are alcoholics and drug addicts, and but sociopathic too. So how can we get beyond it? You know, I think face-to-face interactions somehow through churches, through schools, set up rap groups. If you were to go in and say, I'd love to have a rap group in of sophomores in you know, such and such a high school, you know, could we do that? And just get started that way. Let's just go there. I'll tell you, it's kind of astonishing to me how the simple act, and I know you probably already do this, but just taking your own alarm system off and permitting yourself a great deal of curiosity and interest about the person in front of you, you're opening a door. There is a starvation to be recognized. A starvation to be recognized. Finally, someone's listening to my story. Turns out to be a really powerful thing. And if you come back, you know, you get a whole relationship going with the person, the door opens even further. And they're brothers and, you know, co-students, it opens even further. So a little hanging around and having listening sessions, I think is a very powerful thing. And you know what I've discovered, you know, I've got gray hair, I've been at this a long time, that when I'm not hearing something, when I'm I'm not getting through. If I read the transcript of an interview I've done, I think, oh, this is terrible. It's me that got in the way. It's it wasn't a boring person I was talking to. I was listening to them in a boring way. I wasn't interested. That's a little humble pie I pass on as a listener and ethnographer what I've discovered. And the really great interviews is when I managed to keep my ears open.
Yeah, this happens in journalism too. We're going to take another question and then move to Mindy because time is running fast. Very interesting. Fatmet Bakit, she talks about how the Arab community voted and she wants to ask a question.
Hi, how are you? Actually, my question is, just give me 1 second.
Yeah, you're talking about how the Christians favored Trump over.
Yeah, actually, we spoke a lot with, I interview a lot of Christian people, some of them friends, some of them we don't know. We just spoke to them about why they are defending Trump and they give their voice to them. And most of them, they agree with all the decision and law he banned the 8 Arab Muslim country. That's one of the reasons they are voting for him. And also they claim that they doesn't need any more refugee in the country. Also, they doesn't like Biden or doesn't vote for Biden because they think that he is helping people to stay home and not encourage people to go to work and, depend on the government ad. What do you think about all these things?
Well, I've heard them too. It's sort of, the first kind of line you get from them on these things. Why do Christians, especially Christians, support Trump when he seems to fly in the face of every tenet of Christianity and Islam, of course, too. But why do they? I have a little theory. And it is that Donald Trump has a way of insinuating himself into the dominant metaphor, the dominant paradigm of the evangelical Christian, which is that a savior is coming, right? A savior, you're in trouble, but someone says, I am you, you are me, I will save you. Only I will save you. And then that person, Donald Trump, says, oh, but I have many enemies, the treasonous press and the deep state, the Democratic Party, Muslims are all, making my life hard. I am suffering. Donald Trump watch what he's doing. He's saying, I'm suffering. And then he's saying, I'm suffering for you. That, to Christian ears, suffering for me. Who is suffering for me?
Christ, yeah.
I know. So I know it's hard to believe.
Very interesting.
Just kind of leave yourself open and sit a little while with that interpretation. And then he gets COVID.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you're really suffering for me. You've been tough. You didn't wear your mask. And now you're really suffering for me. And
we have some amazing questions in the chat, but we're going to move on to our second speaker for now. But we'll go back to the questions, Arlie, if you can hang on over there, because it's fascinating what you're talking about. And I'm so pleased to welcome Mindy Romero. And I met her through a friend of mine, Sherry Jeffy. She's a retired professor from USC, and she recommended we talk to her. And so she's here. So thank you so much, Mindy, founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC's Sol Price School of Public Policy. What do you think of all this?
Well, so far, really interesting conversation, of course. Pleasure to follow the professor. I'm going to jump in. I actually have some slides to share with you. I want to step back for a moment and just talk a little bit about the results of the election in terms of kind of framing the conversation, what we know, what we don't know, and then advance along in terms of specifically around race. So do I have permission to share? I think I'm a co-host already.
You are co-host at this point, so you can share.
Okay. You should see my slides.
Yes, we see them.
Okay, great. I always want to double check. Let me move the images down. And I just titled the presentation the same as the hour today. All right. One more moment. There we go. I want to make sure I can see everything. Okay, just jumping in. So in terms of the general election that we just had, in many ways we're still going through, I'm sure you all know, right, that we have seen just phenomenal turnout in the United States. Not a record, but the highest, at least according to numbers from the US Elections Project, since 1900, right? Almost 67% of eligible, and that's adult citizens, voted in the US. And to get to the heart of the question today, many people, though, puzzled that it was so close, right? Disheartened, really almost, whether you're a Biden or a Trump supporter, why was it so close? And particularly if you had deep concerns around Trump, maybe very disappointed in your fellow Americans, fellow voters, right? For so many voting for Donald Trump. And yes, it was more than 74 million, the highest other than Biden. And it appears that about half the country, right, and we've seen this narrative, right, in the media and other places, half the country supports a candidate, and really whom the other half finds viscerally in some way unacceptable, right? Trump supporters also find Biden unacceptable. And the blame game has been played, certainly for those that were deeply disappointed that Trump lost, but didn't win Florida, right? Or wondering why just period it was so close, looking to groups like Latinos and talking about disappointing performance by Biden in areas like Miami-Dade, the Latino support of Trump in the Rio Grande and other places. And, of course, and we could talk about this in the Q&A if you wanted to as well, but of course, a lot of this is based on just a complete misunderstanding of the Latino community and the fact that it's not a monolithic group. But perhaps a stronger emphasis that I want to make right now is that we would expect this blame game. It happens every single election, right? I do a lot of research in the elections. I do research in the elections field. I talk to a lot of reporters in my work every election cycle. And I always get questions, well-intended reporters, of course. The burning questions that are out there are always, what is the strength going to be of the Latino vote this year? What will it be of the Asian Americans or African Americans? Will young people finally turn out to vote and be the decisive factor in this election? And there's always that inquiry up front, but the expectations are often based not on a realistic kind of understanding of what to expect in turnout of particularly historically underrepresented groups. So what happens is, come election day or after election day, there's always some degree of disappointment, no matter who won the election. Why didn't Latinos turn out more? Why didn't young people? Oh my gosh, we saw this in 2016, right? Many conversations, media and other places, saying, young people failed. If they had just turned out, right, Trump wouldn't have won, that sort of thing. It's a narrative that really sets groups up to fail. And we really should expect it, right? And work, I would argue, to counter it. And I do in my work, when I talk to reporters or I do panels or presentations, I'm really cautioning people to understand if they're looking for a jump in the Latino vote or a jump in the youth vote, what are they really expecting? If they're expecting numbers to be anywhere close to whites, for instance, or young to be closer to older voters, that's not going to happen, right? Disparities are entrenched in our electoral system, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the media play a role in setting up this narrative and how things are talked about afterwards, certainly. And also, if we see low turnout, kind of regardless of who won the race, there should be a set of conversations around why there's that low turnout. And often the group that quote unquote fails is blamed somehow internally, right? That they were apathetic. They young people didn't care. What happened? The Latinos weren't the sleeping giant. How could an African-American voter vote for Trump? That sort of thing, as opposed to understanding, again, the nuances amongst groups and why they support candidates and not. And then if his overall turnout is not as high as we expect, understanding the very significant barriers that are in place for groups to participate, right? And understanding why turnout is lower. So the other point I want to make here up front is that it really wasn't half of America that or nearly half of America that voted for Donald Trump, right? We know that about 85 million eligible voters, adult citizens, didn't turn out, even in this incredibly high, historically, turnout. We want to see turnout always higher, but 67% is historically high, unfortunately, I would say, because obviously we want that to be even bigger. So 85 million Americans that didn't turn out. So if you do the numbers, really, Trump received about roughly 31% of the country's eligible voters. Biden got about 33% of the eligible voters. So we can walk away from that and say, how could half of America, right, on either end? But here's also something very important to note, is that those that didn't vote, right, the voting electorate is not representative of the US population. It is older, whiter, wealthier, more educated. But definitely in terms of race ethnicity, it is wider. In every state, then, of course, in California, we're more diverse, but it's always wider than the population is. So the whites are always overrepresented amongst voters than they are a part of the population. It varies across states, but we know this. And for those that don't vote, they have very different preferences, policy preferences, preferences for candidates. So this has already been noted in the exit polls. And remember, exit polls are of voters, right? And they are historically, consistently problematic for voters of color and young people. We want to say that. So we know that, but they're at least initially after an election, the best that we have in terms of data. But of voters, right, we know that overwhelmingly voters of color, there was variation, but as a group, right, supported Biden over Trump. And we might suspect that of the population, not just of voters of color, that would be even more so. But here, just, if only whites voted, we know from the exit polls, 58% of white voters supported Trump in this election. Overwhelming voters of color, as I said, supported Biden. Let's talk about California for a second, though. And these numbers have evolved since election day. They keep updating these are just CNN exit polls. Obviously, there's a few sources out there, but we'll just stick, and we know that there is some variation, but we'll just stick for simplicity of conversation with this. The numbers have been updated as they get updated, as we expect them to be over the last few weeks. And now California is at 45% of white voters in California chose Trump. And 51% chose Biden. That's a 4 percentage point difference in a state of California that might surprise a lot of Californians in the way we think of ourselves as such a blue state. If only whites voted, obviously be a very different situation nationally, and it would be a really close race in California. And Trump's level of support from white voters overall nationally was about the same as 2016, which also might, right? We've kind of alluded to that, also surprises people. So just a couple of quick slides here on disparities, just want to emphasize. So we have differences in preferences around party and candidates, and we have differences in disparities of those who actually turn out, and that's why we have a representative, an electorate that's not representative. So, and there are real implications, not just for candidates, but ultimately for the policy implications from those candidates, right? So let me move here. Well, I just had a point. If disparities in turnout were eliminated, of course, the election results would have looked different and would have constituted a much stronger mandate for Biden, we can at least expect. So just to give you, we don't have the numbers yet by race ethnicity nationally for 2020. These numbers here are from the current population survey, a product of the census, but I can show you 2016. In 2016, the turnout for that data source was 61%. You can see whites at 65%, again, eligible voter turnout of adult citizens, blacks at 59%, Latinos, Asian Americans down into the 40s, right? Significant differences by race, ethnicity. And just really quickly to make that point that I said they were entrenched. This is a timeline, same data source, current population survey, going back to 1980. The purple line is the total population. The blue line is white, non-Latino or non-Asian. You can see that group has the highest turnout, and you can see much lower Black, Latino, Asian American. Black, there's an exception, of course, in 2012. But what story we see here is a consistent story of significant gaps in turnout, right? Which leads to significant underrepresentation. So let's talk now about race and politics explicitly. So we know that our country has a long and deep and ugly history of racism, structural racism, interpersonal racism, the list goes on. That is still the case. We're dealing with that history, and we still are a racist country in so many ways. Trump's presidency has made more, I'll say more, not all, but more Americans face this reality where Barack Obama was elected president, and we heard so much about the US being post-racial. We knew that wasn't the case, right? And we're really faced with this reality and very difficult to run from it with the Trump presidency. But here's the thing that's so important, right, for our conversation today. The rhetoric around race, period, but particularly Donald Trump's rhetoric, divisive rhetoric, is seen very differently by people of different racial and ethnic groups, or people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds and groups. Many of those that oppose Trump, right, in this election, cannot fathom why anyone would vote for somebody, right? Republican or otherwise, take out party. How could someone vote? We hear this over and over again in our own families, friends, neighbors, colleagues, people on social media. How can you vote for somebody who's trafficking in racial tropes if you don't flat out think that he's a racist, period? But Trump supporters, and we've seen a number of surveys, that they often report that they don't see his actions as racist at all. And indeed, if you think about, again, his own strategy and how he talks, how his racist rhetoric is structured, if he's dealing in stereotypes, he's usually using probabilistic stereotypes, right? He's saying, he's not saying all Mexicans are rapists. He's saying they can't, that some are rapists, right? And some are very good people. So he leaves open, and I'm not excusing it by any means, but he leaves open, right, a huge pathway there for people to interpret his statements as just truthful, as just observing patterns, whatever it might be, but they're not racist. Whites and people of color see the persistence, just generally moving away from Trump, of racism in this country, its ongoing impact in this country, right, through contrasting lenses. We're talking past each other. Professor Hostrad will recognize that reference from one of our colleagues in the sociology field. Whites overall less likely to recognize the current existence of individual and institutional forms of racism. A recent example, we think of the George Floyd protests, right, and his death. Differences in surveys in terms of how people saw that, right? And how they certainly reacted to the increased demands for racial and criminal justice reform. We also saw a very different framing on conservative media versus mainstream or left media. So where do we go from here? So regardless, and this is going to sound a little pie in the sky, so forgive me, but Pilar tasked me with talking about going forward. So I'm not saying any of this is easy, but regardless of political outcomes, we've all got to, as a nation, and I mean every sector, right? To me, it's really not pie in the sky. This is a tremendous amount of work, but we must all commit to fight for a better America, for a more representative voting electorate, which is a key part of this, and for a less polarized one. We've got a long way to go. We have to recognize that to see an accessible and truly inclusive democracy. If Biden won, some of these conversations wouldn't be happening, right? But if Biden won, we're still faced with an incredibly underrepresented electorate, right? Or non-represented electorate. The majority of Americans do believe, including Republicans combined, not the majority of Republicans, but combined, that Trump fans polarization and divisiveness, but many people look beyond that, right? And still vote for him. He's not going to be our president now. We know that. He won't ever concede, but he won't be our president. And we can begin to work past this. I think he will be a factor in how difficult it will be, right, for us to forge a path ahead, because he isn't going away, and we know that. But many of the steps aside from Trump are going to be very difficult for all of us to take. So talk isn't enough, right? We've got to fight for change, of course, in our institutions. We've got to demand our elected officials, which, you know, with a runoff race in Georgia, it's even more challenging, but that they work together. What a concept, right? To face our challenges like, you know, COVID-19 and an economic recession and criminal justice reform, all of that. But really, we have to also educate around race and power. And of course, there's a key role here in the media. Educate about things, if we're just talking about the election, how an election is run and how ballots are counted and all that sort of thing. But specifically around race and power, it's no accident, I think, that the Trump administration was starting to remove, right, requirements around racial bias training, for instance, right? And we need to educate all aspects of our society, because we do talk past each other. Instead of saying, oh my God, all of those people are racist, or how could they think this way? Understanding where they're coming from has already been talked to today, but also understanding that for many people that are conservative, if they took a lie detector test, they sincerely don't see racism, right? And attacking it at that level, right? Educating around that. Again, not an easy thing. And I just have a couple more slides here too. I don't want to go over too much. We need to reach out to each other as people, neighbors, family members. This is not, right, an easy thing, but to begin a positive dialogue. Media can encourage that, right? Even talk about how to do that in ways that feel maybe less scary or less confrontational. And we need to do this with our eyes open about our many differences, to understand that we do see things through different lenses. Whether, you know, whether we like it or not, we do see things through different lenses. We must honestly address how we view racial bias. It has to be out on the table. We have to work better to understand it. We're never going to get to where we hope to be to any real degree unless we kind of meet each other where we're at on that. And to the education component of it, I've been saying for years, I'm not the only one, of course, we have an abysmal civics education system in our schools that has a direct through line to low participation and a disconnection that people feel to the political process, certainly. But also young people need to be taught media literacy, how to, you know, sift through misinformation and disinformation that's now even more critical. And they need to learn simple things like, critical things like how elections are administered in the US, right? And hopefully to be our protectors going forward of our democratic norms, because we do have a constitution. Our democracy is really functions on norms and people understanding these, believing them, and wanting to carry them forward. And lastly, just to end on a positive note, I will say that we should celebrate the real progress that we've made in this election. So I said highest turnout since 1900, 67%, want to see it much higher than that. But that is still thrilling as a election researcher to see that big of a jump. We've had now 3 election cycles where we've seen higher than expected turnout, higher than normal turnout. 2016, 2018 was very high for a midterm, and now, of course, this historically high turnout. We have an opportunity to build on that. It will, potentially even a new era in higher turnout in the United States, but we have to do the work. And I hope not to see us, right, that hill we've been climbing to go back down again. All odds are that it will, unless we do the work. And of course, we can celebrate that people of color, young people play decisive roles in key states. No matter what your politics are, we must continue to vote. And, you know, here's the pie in the sky statement, but it's true. Our democracy is only as strong if we're willing to fight for it. And just conversations about race, honest conversations about where we stand. And if only whites voted in the United States, what that would look like. Is a key part that we can't run away from, and that we have to talk about, and hopefully talk about it in a responsible way, in a respectful way. But if we're ever going to counter that, we have to, again, meet us where we really are in all of those conversations. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Professor Romero. That was quite a class that you gave us. Thank you so much. And I feel a bit inspired, that we can do better. I'm going to go straight to our third speaker because we're running out of time, and he's on. So I want to welcome Davin Phoenix, Assistant Professor of Political Science, University of California, Irvine. But more importantly, he wrote a book called The Anger Gap: How Race Shapes Emotions in Politics. And I think this is very relevant. So welcome, Professor Phoenix.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I will try to be very brief, given we're short on time. And apologies for having to come to the meeting. So I don't have any slides. I just want to highlight, I think, some of the trends that I've uncovered in years of assessing how race shapes who gets to be publicly angry over politics, and how the polity, how the media, and how political officials treat different groups inequitably based on their airing of their grievances. So the main takeaway from the research in the book is that people of color express much less anger than their white counterparts over the same kind of political objects, whether it's reflecting on elections that didn't turn out the way they want, reflecting on the out-partisan or the kind of things that they identify, like polarization or specific policies. So this runs in stark contrast, at least in the case of African Americans, right, to that very pervasive stereotype of the angry Black person. So not only are people of color expressing less anger, but anger is much less mobilizing of political behavior for people of color than it is for white Americans. And so when we see white Americans expressing anger over politics across the ideological spectrum, they're more likely to act on that anger, to go to the voting booth or donate to candidates, canvass for candidates, but also to contact elected officials, work with community members, protest and boycott. In contrast, when Black and Latinx and Asian Americans express anger over politics, they're not anywhere near to the degree of their white counterparts more likely to vote or canvass or donate, not any more likely to contact officials. They are more likely to protest and boycott. And so I think we see that play out, right, with a long history of activism from groups of color. What is that representing? That's representing people of color's anger being directed not towards a particular regime within a system or a particular kind of party platform, but at the system itself, a system that they fundamentally believe is not responsive to their interests. So I want to take that question of anger, whereas in the book, I focus on kind of what it does and does not do for people of color. I think Pilar invited me to consider how we think about that anger in the context of 2020 and maybe these gains that Trump made with white voters, maybe particularly white women voters. So let's actually take it back to 2016. When we think about ways in which voters of color kind of depart from expectations, oftentimes the inquisition becomes, well, why did they do this? What was wrong with them? Why were they not maybe more sophisticated or more vigilant? So after 2016, when Black and Latinx turnout in particular was lower than expected, there's a lot of hand-wringing over why. So Dr. Romero talked about that sleeping giant, right? This long-running narrative kind of really bounds the way we think about the Latinx turnout. But the question is, right, like if Trump represents a particular threat to these groups, why wouldn't they respond with energetic turnout to stave off that threat? And my research says when people of color encounter these threats, they're more likely to withdraw from politics or pursue alternative forms of acting. And so by problematizing the disinclination to vote, we're kind of missing the fuller picture of what people of color view as utility or lack of utility in that vote, primarily or acutely when they're in positions of threat. In contrast, when white Americans, to the surprise of many pollers and pundits, kind of came out in fuller force for Trump, creating that unlikely victory, I think there's a misread of the emotions that propelled that vote choice. What was the kind of overarching message about that vote? Economic anxiety, right? Anxiety is a specific emotion. It's a fear. It's a sense of unsettling. And what does that emotion translate to, as we know from social psychology? Questioning your predispositions and maybe considering new options. Did Trump kind of represent anxiety or fear, or did he represent anger, right? What does anger represent? When you're angry, and you know, we've all been in this situation, we've all thought, well, I shouldn't have done that, but I was angry, right? You are more impulsive. you're less risk averse, and you feel slighted, and you feel a compulsion to right that wrong. And so anger is a palpable force, not only for getting people active in politics, but for making them double down on what their existing ideas are. And so I see that doubling down effect in 2020. So why is it important for us to distinguish anxiety versus anger? Because you have to understand the object of that anger. The idea was people are anxious because the economy is unsettling, and maybe white Americans feel that the kind of ground is shifting beneath their feet for a bit. And Trump represents kind of an assuring force, right? That they will not lose their dominant status within politics and within society. But if we think about that kind of relationship to that sense of lost status, not as I'm afraid about it, let me speak slower, but I'm more angry about it, we kind of understand the way in which our politics is very much determined by kind of in-groups versus out-groups. And so if we thought, okay, people see some kind of promise represented by Trump in 2016, but 4 years later, they're going to maybe come to their senses or not see Trump as living up to that promise, and seeing the divisiveness and seeing the toll of COVID, seeing kind of the loss of the US standing in the world. There's this maybe expectation that was not founded that white Americans, maybe specifically white women, would move away from Trump. But what did Trump very effectively do throughout those 4 years? Continue to engender and activate that sense of anger. And so that anger, again, causes people to double down. And so even if people can be dissatisfied over the last 4 years, Trump and the media ecosystem around him continually gave them outlets for that anger that were directed away from Trump. And so that's really important for us to understand. Why is that really critical? Because there's almost a sense that, well, people might regret their vote choice in 2016 or regret not voting in 2016. And why might not people regret that? There is a great deal of normalization of Trump and of Trump voters. We can consider how important it is that there were so many very intensive efforts to create these profiles of Trump voters that were often very sympathetic, right? Very understanding. And these come from, an authentic place. People not understanding how so many people could support Trump and trying to understand that. But that has a process of normalizing and legitimizing the grievances that people acted on as they voted for Trump. And so when 2020 comes around, I think this bears out, more people that were probably on the fence in 2016 felt they could comfortably cast that vote in 2020. Why? Because, well, he's been normalized, and kind of the ethos or the mythos of Trump supporters has been normalized. So it's really important for us to think about not just the kind of divisiveness that has been accelerated by Trump, but how those dividing lines, particularly of race, but also of gender and religion and socioeconomic status, are definitive elements of our politics, not just defining the divide between left and right, but even defining the divide within the Democratic faction as well. And so when we think about people being angry over potential loss of status, right, that anger is not going to cause them to evaluate Trump by the metrics that we might expect. And that, I think, really ties together with Dr. Romero's last points there about we have very different lenses through which we see COVID or Racism America, right, or the protests. And so while we kind of can bend over backwards to understand why white people might vote for Trump and think, well, what is the sense of grievance that they're tapping into? Let's draw a contrast between how we can problematize the political behavior of people of color. So remember, early in the primary season, there were people prominent within the Democratic Party that said Black voters were unsophisticated for supporting Biden in the primaries, right? This is similar to the kind of problematizing of turnout rates of Black and Latinx voters in 2016. There's a real important contrast, and I'll end here, right? When white people can vote for Trump, the question becomes, well, what is the problem within the system that we're tapping into? How can we better understand their position so that we can see what the corrective needs to be? When people of color vote against expectations or don't vote in line with what people expect them to vote as. We're not saying, well, let's get a better understanding so that we can better understand what correctives need to be made. We say, well, what's their problem, right? Why are they not sophisticated enough? Why are they not protecting their interests enough? And so it's really important for us to recognize that contrast, because when we're not thinking more concretely about voter disenfranchisement efforts, right? We're not really thinking concretely about how people of color can feel palpably a sense of lack of responsiveness from the system when we don't give people of color the same benefit of the doubt of being strategic political actors that are responding dynamically to the system. Then we can continue to perpetuate these narratives that kind of problematize the ways in which people of color choose to engage or not, while absolving white people of the same scrutiny for making decisions that we don't understand. So I better go ahead and end there.
Thank you so much. And we are over the hour now. I just want to ask one question of the three of you. Right now, we are in a situation where the new grievance for the Trump voter is that the election was stolen. The majority of Republicans apparently believe the election was stolen. And we have a president, I mean, you've seen all the lawsuits. We have a president and a party. We have over 100 members of Congress signing a letter saying, yeah, we want to throw out the elections. Essentially, that's what they're saying. So is this something else that we need to understand, that people want to just essentially eliminate an election just because they don't like who won? Is this the new normal in the United States? Anyone? Arlie, do you have anything to say?
Go ahead.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Okay.
There you are.
Yeah, I just want to say, Mindy and Devin, I really loved your talks. I learned a lot. No, it just, in a second, I would just say it shows how dire the situation is, how important it is that we try and get into the heads of people we don't know and don't agree with. And actually the power of paranoia when people are anxious. And I like that Devin was focusing on emotions. I think that does go to the heart of this. There's anger, but there's also, there's anger gone sideways into paranoia. And I think it's the job of all of us to get what makes that happen and the consequences of it.
Thank you. Mindy?
I'll just say, because of time, bottom line is it's not going away. That's what I was trying to allude to in my presentation. There's tremendous work that we have to do. This is incredibly dangerous right now. It's not going away with Trump. Trump isn't even going away. It's not just about Trump. Certainly the racist aspects of our society is not about Trump. But all of this misinformation and distrust in the electoral system is incredibly dangerous. And you all play a role. I'm so thankful, that you're all here to have this conversation. We're in it for the long haul.
Devin?
Yeah, and I'll just say quickly, I think we can maybe debate the degree to which the guardrails of the system are working. And certainly we can take some solace in the fact that the courts are kind of throwing out these lawsuits, but the fact that a majority of GOP House members and a non-trivial number of state legislatures are on board with this really forces us to interrogate the degree to which the Republican Party is purely an anti-democratic party at this point. We can kind of critique them from the ways in which they mobilize grievance, but if they are looking to actually overturn the will of majority voters, if they're looking to claim that legitimate elections are illegitimate based purely on the outcome and the fact that people that they don't see as supporting them vote in larger numbers, like this is more than polarization, right? This is more than kind of a policy division to overcome, right? This is a fundamentally striking threat to democracy because we're a two-party system. If one of those parties is fundamentally opposed to majoritarian rule, then we have questions, or we have problems that I don't think our typical ways of thinking about party politics equip us to answer. So we have to, I think, have a willingness to break apart from that traditional idea of thinking about the parties as two polar opposites and understand there's two planes upon which they're operating. And one of those parties is operating a plane that's an existential threat to democracy as we know it. And I'm not saying that to be hyperbolic, right? We need to have an appreciation for how our language is not equipped to understand the years-long assault on democratic norms that's been perpetuated by this party.
Thank you so much, Arlie, Mindy, and Davin. I appreciate you being here and just putting up with all this, like, you know, going over time and all that. And I'm sorry we couldn't take more questions, but this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you to all my colleagues for being here. That's it. Next time. See you around.